Welcome to the Summit for Wellness podcast, where we help you climb to the peak of your health. And now, here is your host, Brian Carroll.
Hello, and welcome to episode 59 of the Summit for Wellness podcast. I'm your host, Brian Carroll, and today's episode is brought to you by HANA-1, which is an Ayurvedic herbal blend that helps your body to adapt to the different stressors of life. I actually use it a lot on my backpacking and hiking trips because it also provides a good boost in energy. And since I don't drink coffee, that is kind of my morning pick-me-up that I like to use. So if you want to get your own jar of HANA-1, go to summitforwellness.com/HANAH. Okay, in this episode, we brought on Sara Russell, who is a nutritional therapy practitioner that loves to work on very, very complicated cases. But today we will be talking about the type of work that she does with the hypermobile population. So if you don't know what the hypermobile population is, those are people who have very flexible joints in their body. But just because a lot of times we think of it as a joint-related issue, there's actually a lot of other health issues that come along with it. So in my conversation with Sara, we talk a lot about the different health issues that hypermobile people might be experiencing, and they don't know how to help themselves. So we'll dive in pretty deep into what people can do to help themselves. And she also has some really good advice for just people in general who are trying to get better. Let's dive right into my conversation with Sara Russell. Sara Russell is a nutritional therapy practitioner who works remotely with clients worldwide, specializing in complex health conditions. Sara's approach is client-centered, approaching each client's health goals foundationally from a root cause-oriented bio-individual perspective. Sara has extensive experience with hypermobility spectrum disorder and the Ehlers-Danlos Syndromes. She resides in the Tuscan countryside with her husband and 6-year-old son. Thank you for coming onto the show, Sara.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you so much for inviting me. Actually, I have an announcement. My son just turned 7 4 days ago. So, yeah, I have to update my bio.
Yeah, and for people that don't know, this is our third time recording, so we have not been able to update that they are now 7 years old. Congratulations to your son.
Yeah, thank you.
So as we get started here talking about hypermobility, let's dive into your background a little bit and what you have gone through yourself with hypermobility.
Okay, well, I'll try to keep it kind of succinct, but essentially I was, I started out in life as a very bendy kid. People kept telling me I should join the circus and stuff. I would go to the circus and come back, and my dad would be like, "Oh, what did the contortionist do?" And I would just show him everything. And he was like, "Oh, great! I get to save a ticket on the circus." Once I would spend months at a time limping, or things being kind of not quite right. A lot of neck pain and back pain that other kids my age didn't have. I was a little bit of a hunchback kid in middle school already. And sometimes I would just mysteriously dislocate various things in non-traumatic ways, like turning a key in a keyhole kind of thing, or, things that shouldn't really cause that. But my mom was like, "Oh yeah, that's totally normal." And when I started taking on babysitting work as a 12 or 13-year-old, she instructed me on how to be careful not to, cause wrist dislocations and elbow dislocations and shoulder dislocations by pulling too hard on the child. And I realized only much later that this was just a family strategy, because hypermobility runs in my mom's side of the family, and to her it was all normal. And to everybody else, I was very, very strange. I have a body that just doesn't work the same way that other people's bodies do. And I've had some, other non-hypermobile people. And And I, basically never really thought to mention my history of joint hypermobility to, to any doctor who was taking my history for one of my many mysterious health problems. And I just remember doctors looking at me, scratching their heads, going, "Oh my gosh, I've never seen a patient with so many symptoms as yours." And I was very lucky that nobody really wrote me off as being, a mental case, partly because my blood work was never normal enough, for someone to say, "Oh, it's all in your head, you're just anxious," or, a lot of the things that a lot of people with so-called invisible disabilities tend to experience. So, I had a multitude of just physical pain related issues and structural issues, difficulty even just, climbing up a flight of stairs when I was in my early 20s, and just felt like that shouldn't quite be so bad at that age. Things have gotten better over the years, but still. And, just digestive and multi-systemic issues, really.
Yeah, and knowing you have a very extensive background in a lot of different areas of health and not just hypermobility. So does a lot of that research that you've done and a lot of that studying that you have done, is that because of all the issues that you have gone through with hypermobility?
It's interesting. In part, yes, and in part, no. I think that really having a lot of health challenges across different body systems made me very empathetic, as far as, being detailed oriented and listening to people and figuring out what might be wrong and how we could help kind of, get things working better, and finding each person's kind of optimal place in health. But what's really interesting is that when I signed up for my nutritional therapy training, I actually went into it thinking, really wanting to specialize in fertility and pregnancy, which is actually an area that I've never had any struggles with. So I kind of joked about, oh, this is basically the only problem I've never had in my life. I've had all these other health problems. But, I felt so, I was at home with my youngest child, my son Gregorio, who just turned 7, I just thought what a blessing it is to be a parent and have children. And I was thinking about all the people who struggle to conceive, and that was really ultimately what pushed me in that direction, more than really a full awareness of how much I myself had gone through. It was more of let's help other people fix this this area of life that so many people are struggling with today. But, in my practice, what ultimately happened was, while I have maintained a chunk of my practice that is oriented at fertility and pregnancy, even my whole practice has taken more of a complex client, complex chronic illness kind of turn. So even a lot of the fertility work that I'm doing these days really does rotate around people who have specific health challenges, or even, unnamed kind of vague, kind of mysterious challenges that have prevented them from conceiving or carrying a pregnancy to full term, as opposed to just, working with infertility or fertility, pregnancy as a more general kind of focus. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And since we're talking about complexity, hypermobility is very complex because there's a lot more going on than just hypermobile joints. So can you talk about what hypermobility is and what percentage of people have it?
Sure. So, it's difficult to say exactly what percentage of the population is. So a reasonable estimate is that about 10% of the population worldwide as an average qualifies as having hypermobile joints. And a fair portion of those people are actually asymptomatic. So many of them may never have health problems associated with hypermobility. So there's a difference between being, between what is called benign hypermobility. So, think, a very healthy yoga instructor or gymnastics teacher, somebody who just really doesn't have health problems but is hypermobile, versus a person who has hypermobile joints and who has gastrointestinal problems, chronic pain, fatigue, sore muscle, structural instability, difficulty maintaining posture, issues, even just with staying in an upright position without having extreme lightheadedness and feeling like they need to constantly lie down to prevent fainting, those kinds of things. Even allergies, extreme allergies and chemical sensitivities are associated with hypermobility for reasons that are just kind of beginning to be understood to some extent. And essentially, because joint hypermobility is just the surface, it's just the tip of the iceberg, and it is an indication of essentially a dysfunction in connective tissue, and so much of our body is made of connective tissue, so including our eyes and most of our digestive tract, and essentially 80% of the protein in our body is connective tissue protein, and that's a lot. So if your body isn't able to properly make that, or if the extracellular matrix that is responsible for giving integrity and structure to your connective tissue doesn't function, then you can definitely run into a lot of trouble. So the most reasonable estimate that I've seen in terms of symptomatic hypermobility, what used to all be lumped together as hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, which at the time was actually called Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome hypermobile type, is about 2 to 3% of the general population. So people who have joint hypermobility as part of a constellation of complex health problems that span across multiple body systems. And then there is a percentage of the population that is hypermobile and very healthy with no issues whatsoever. So I don't want anybody, who's maybe listening to this call who has asymptomatic, flexible joints, or has children with asymptomatic, very flexible joints and no health problems whatsoever. I don't want you to get worried. It doesn't mean that anything bad will ever happen to you. So let's just make sure that this is clear, that we're really just talking about, the hypermobility spectrum disorder and Ehlers-Danlos, hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome as being disorders that affect people who are not just hypermobile on the surface, but also have symptoms across many different body systems.
So earlier you mentioned how when you were growing up, you learned not to pull too hard on the hand just in case you dislocate like wrists or fingers or any kind of joints like that. And so you had mentioned that it was something that's been passed down through generations in your family, this hypermobility.
Yeah.
Is it pretty common to have hypermobility through family lineages? And if so, do you then take a bigger look at families' histories so that you can understand a little bit more about the hypermobility systemically in the person that you're working with?
Yes, absolutely. So, in fact, symptomatic hypermobility, both in terms of hypermobility spectrum disorder and hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, this is the realm not of rheumatologists, although there are some rheumatologists who do work very, very well with these conditions, but really of geneticists. So it's the geneticist who is the doctor who almost always diagnoses these disorders. Of course, if a person goes to their primary care doctor and says, I have, debilitating headaches, I have terrible fatigue, I have all these gastrointestinal problems, blah, 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 and the doctor never asks and the patient never says, I have joint hypermobility, by the way. A lot of patients with joint hypermobility have no idea that their joint hypermobility is abnormal. It's really interesting. So, yes, these are... by and large, I mean, even though there are many cases of, somebody saying, okay, I'm patient 0 in my family, I'm the first person, to have this issue, almost always taking a good family history, it will be quite easy to figure out how this passed through the family line, even though it is worth specifying that while 12 of the 13 forms of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome have clearly identified genetic mutations that are associated with those conditions, hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, as well as hypermobility spectrum disorder, and these two are not, there's a lot of controversy, and the kind of predominant view has changed over time as to whether they're the same condition or different conditions. It is a little bit of an artifact to distinguish the two in many people's opinions, but these two conditions are not associated with one single genetic mutation, and the most reasonable, up-to-date scientific research and hypothesis suggests that these are both that this is a condition, or possibly two conditions depending on how you classify them, that are associated with a cluster of gene mutations. So looking through the family lines of people both with hypermobility spectrum disorder and hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, what geneticists have noticed is that while in the past, up to just a few years ago, all the scientific literature used to state that hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which later, as I noted, became kind of divided into hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and hypermobility spectrum disorder, but was just one condition. But these two conditions they used to be assumed to be autosomal dominant. But what was noted by geneticists who specialized in these conditions was that there wasn't a clear just 50% transmission, and there was more expression in females than in males. And so the question was, how can it be exactly autosomal dominant if more than 50% of offspring of parents with this condition are, inherit it? And why do so many more women, proportionally to men, have this condition? Because with autosomal dominant conditions, it should be right around 50%, and it should be an even split. So what is being hypothesized right now is that there is a cluster of genes. So it would be called an oligogenetic hypothesis, where essentially there are anywhere between 3 and maybe 6 or 7 genes, or maybe 3 to 5 genes, they're not really sure, that when they are mutated can cause varied levels of expression of hypermobility alongside connective tissue dysfunction with this constellation of issues that I mentioned, which can vary from person to person in unique and interesting ways. So, the reason why there can be a patient 0 is because maybe dad has 2 genes, and that's really not enough to express very much, except maybe, a bendy thumb that hasn't really ever given the person any issues in life. Or, and then mom has a couple of those genes. Well, then they have a kid who maybe inherits all 4 of those genes. And all of a sudden you have a very symptomatic hypermobile person with a constellation of health problems that maybe everybody in the family says, wow, we've never seen this before. And yet it's always been kind of lurking latently in the 2 branches of the family tree. More often than not, you'll see, at least in one of the 2 parents' sides of the family, that there is symptomatic hypermobility if you take a careful enough family history.
Since we're still learning what it is in the gene structure that might be leading to hypermobility, do any of the tests like the 23andMe or other genetic tests, are they looking for hypermobility yet, or is there still not enough data to fully understand what genes to be looking for to show the hypermobility?
Yeah, there really isn't, to my knowledge, at least not in any of the gene interpretation software systems that I've ever seen, used with 23andMe. There is no, I haven't looked at every single one of them. There aren't any that are showing, specific stuff that if you go through the raw data, it is possible that, if you know exactly what you're doing, if you're going through the millions and millions, I don't know how many, thousands of genes are in the raw data, as opposed to one of those reports that's generated by one of the softwares that interprets the 23andMe, it is possible that something will show up. But really what we're looking at is very much uncharted territory. And I don't think that the 23andMe, by and large, unless it's being interpreted by somebody who's looking at the raw data with a very interesting lens is going to be of much use to people in this specific area. I've seen, SNP reports generated by various different SNP systems, from clients who have used the 23andMe and hypermobile clients. There's just no correlation between any of the stuff that is, any of the methylation genes or any of these other things. I mean, the occurrence of these single nucleotide polymorphisms is really pretty much the same in the hypermobile population as in, a non-hypermobile population. So it is possible that there is something that is being picked up by 23andMe in the raw data that nobody is really using. Now, geneticists are, like I said, there are 12 forms of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, 13 forms of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, 12 of which are known to have a specific gene causing a specific form of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Now, there are some forms of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, like the classical form, that has a couple of, 2 or 3 different genes, but it's still one gene causing one specific condition. Whereas with hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and hypermobility spectrum disorder, there are theories as to, gene clusters. So it costs a lot of money to run genetic testing, and most geneticists, who are even, it depends, of course, if you have a medical geneticist who's doing clinical work as well as back office research and has a lot of funding, there are some clinics in different parts of the world that are collecting large amounts of data and are just waiting. They just keep it there for years, and they're waiting until they have the money to run additional tests to identify the specific genes. Now, there is an interesting theory proposed or hypothesis proposed by Dr. McGlathery, which is called the RCCX theory, and I do think that it's very fascinating. And also there has been some interesting recent research that has been done on cultured cells. Basically they culture the fibroblasts from under the skin or from muscle tissue. I'm a little bit rusty right now, forgive me, but essentially they take these fibroblasts and they feed them, very expensive bovine serum in order to get them to proliferate, and then they look at them under powerful microscopes, and then what they observe is the difference between how the fibroblasts and the extracellular matrix behaves depending on which form of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or hypermobility spectrum disorder is diagnosed in that specific patient versus a healthy, non-hypermobile population. And what's really interesting is that they do see incredible differences between basically in structure and function of both the extracellular matrix and the fibroblasts, depending on what condition the person has. So even, taking 100 different hypermobile people with, relatively similar looking symptoms, again, if you have one of those 12 forms of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome that is not the hypermobile type, they all do come with some degree of hypermobility. But if one of those forms that is associated with a one gene to a specific disease correspondence versus the hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and the hypermobility spectrum disorder, which are kind of a unique cluster of, symptoms with a very interesting presentation. Basically, the extracellular matrix seems to just essentially not be there. So there's a lack of structure due to the lack of integrity in the extracellular matrix that isn't really present in the other forms of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. If I'm remembering the research correctly, I don't review it every day, but it was fresh in my mind a few weeks ago.
Yeah, it's interesting just hearing all the research that is coming out about it. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Earlier, you had hinted at different health issues that people might experience when they have systemic hypermobility. So can you go into some of the common health issues that you typically see in the hypermobile client population?
Sure. Yeah. So often what I'll see is a mixture of, extreme allergies, sensitivities, sometimes a diagnosis of mast cell activation issues, sometimes neurological dysfunction that can span from fainting episodes or near fainting episodes to orthostatic intolerance, chiropractic and structural issues where, the person has atlantoaxial instability or craniocervical instability. A lot of the time people who have Arnold-Chiari malformation type 1, which basically involves the slipping of the cerebellar tonsils down into the space where they're not supposed to go in, because essentially the ligament around the brain is very loose. It's very lax. So it's not just around the joints, it's around the brain too. So that can cause debilitating headaches and pain and a lot of neurological issues. A lot of those people have hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome or hypermobility spectrum disorder. So there's an overlap between these conditions. The gastroenterologists are one of the few medical specialties that do often know about Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and hypermobility spectrum disorder, because they see so many people who have debilitating gastroenterological symptoms like severe reflux, gastroparesis, very delayed gastric emptying, a lot of small intestinal bacterial overgrowth because of the inefficient and ineffective, motility in the GI tract. The muscle tone is poor, not just in the voluntary muscles, but also in the muscles inside the body. So the gastrointestinal tract, as well as, of course, so much of the tissue in the gastrointestinal tract being made of connective tissue, collagen, for example, eye problems, detached retinas, issues with, detachment of the lens to a lot of, this is not specific, but, just functional vision problems. Obviously, that's not enough to make one suspect that a person is maybe hypermobile, but slow wound healing, a lot of stretch marks, saggy skin, unusual scarring. These are, very common issues that are often observed in people with hypermobility that is manifesting in a symptomatic way. And of course, frequent, twisting your ankle very frequently, dislocating a wrist or dislocating another joint, like, the shoulder, and just from non-traumatic kinds of things, a lot of bruising, easy bleeding. These, our blood vessels are made of connective tissue. So a lot of the delayed healing, a lot of the bruising, a lot of the bleeding issues just come from inefficient capillaries and whatnot. So, and sometimes a lot of the functional problems that people with hypermobility have can be mistaken for adrenal and thyroid dysfunction, and the tests will often come back okay, sometimes not so great. And then, of course, anxiety and depression are very common, and in people with hypermobility who also have symptoms, and it's very complicated to try to define to what extent the hypermobility is a cause and to what extent it's a consequence of the anxiety and depression, because it's definitely, a vicious cycle. So, for example, the scientific literature has discussed the fact that the lax ligaments around the brain do kind of inevitably make people with these conditions more susceptible to neuropsychiatric problems. There's a higher incidence in the hypermobile population versus the non-hypermobile population of anxiety, of depression, of panic disorders, of obsessive compulsive disorder, and even obsessive compulsive personality disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. So, just less resilience in a way. And this, to some extent, could just be because of the ligament laxity around the brain. To some extent, there is also a higher incidence of autism for very complicated reasons that I think would require a whole other, podcast to discuss those connections. But definitely, a little bit of a different kind of neurological and neuropsychiatric presentation compared to the non-symptomatic population. And definitely, the chronic pain, the chronic fatigue that a lot of people with symptomatic hypermobility have, even the issues with sensitivities and allergies that so many other people can't understand. I mean, extreme reactions. My husband once came home from the dry cleaners with a shirt that he had dry cleaned. He hugged me and I just literally fainted in his arms because of the fumes from the chemicals that the dry cleaner had used. Just even going out in public in an Italian city, sometimes I do have to wear a filtration mask, and it does, feeling like you are a little bit confined and you can't really, eat what normal people eat, and you can't really breathe the way normal people breathe, can cause its own set of anxiety, I'm sure, and partly because of how cultures respond to people who have these issues. I mean, a lot of the time they're just not understood or tolerated very well, or well supported, especially if the person doesn't have a diagnosis. They're just looked at as hypochondriacs. So that can be, very difficult. Even, another thing that has been fairly well studied in the literature in the hypermobile population is kinesiophobia. So essentially, in a nutshell, kinesiophobia is the fear of movement. And a lot of people who, who have suffered dislocations, just by, performing simple movements, like I was talking about turning a key, or even, typing sometimes, or holding a pen, or, hip dislocations from, just simple activities like doing like a martial arts class, and you do a twist and all of a sudden you have dislocated your hip. And so that can definitely cause a fear of movement. So the person becomes more sedentary because the reasoning is, well, if I don't do anything dangerous, and life, of course, daily movements, even like carrying a cast iron pan to the table with food in it can feel like a threat to the wrists or to the fingers. So the world feels threatening, and so the person starts to move less and less, and that is its own problem. And of course, physical therapists who specialize in hypermobility are very aware of the kinesiophobia that a lot of patients can develop over time. And there's another interesting side to the puzzle, which is, when a physical therapist who isn't very experienced or confident in these disorders comes face to face with somebody who has a history of just, maybe dislocating their shoulder multiple times a night in their sleep, they're afraid of working with this person for fear that, maybe they'll give them an exercise that will cause the person pain and suffering and dislocation. So there's a kind of a kinesiophobia that the practitioner can develop as well. Can I touch you? Will you break? Kind of thing. And that it's very difficult, I think. I think it's one of the hardest aspects of daily life. And I personally think, we all have our own kinds of thresholds for injury, but as somebody who spent a couple of years as in her late teens, myself, working nights and going to school during the day and babysitting in the afternoons just so I wouldn't sleep, because sleep actually, was a time when my body would relax and I was more likely to actually injure myself because I didn't have as much control over my movements. So my situation was a little bit different from kinesiophobia. I really liked to maintain kind of control through alertness and being aware of my movements. And that was kind of my illusion of, I won't get injured if I just do this. And of course I would still get injured. And then of course I had a big health crash because for a year I was only sleeping on Mondays. I'm so embarrassed to say this in public, but yeah, literally that was my day that I would sleep. It's a difficult balance to find. Nonetheless, I do have to say that, as scary as it can be to suffer strange injuries and dislocations from just normal everyday stuff, I actually learned a really great lesson from, things like dislocating my shoulder while I sleep. And I dislocated my scapula while I was giving a talk last March. It was very painful. What I learned from that is that it really doesn't make that much sense to be afraid of doing stuff in the world. You can either, try to live in a sort of cocoon, but there's no safety if you can't even sleep without getting injured. You just kind of surrender and live the adventurous life that you want to live. So I travel, I do stuff. I go up and down stairs. I live in a rural area. I walk up and down the hill. I actually maintain my proprioception, which is another area of health that can be impaired in people with symptomatic hypermobility. So you're not really aware of where the various parts of your body are in space, which is another reason why we can possibly get injured more often. So it can cause issues of balance and whatnot. I maintain my proprioception by doing not only my physical therapy exercises, but also just walking barefoot in the river and walking from rock to rock. I teach my son to do the same thing. As a kid, I climbed trees. My parents never told me, oh, don't do this or you might break. So grateful to them for that. I didn't have a diagnosis, but we definitely did have a family history of people getting injured in funny ways. And my mom would tell me about all the adventures she had as a kid, just, jumping from rooftop to rooftop. Some of it may be an exaggeration, but she was a very, she had a lot of fun in her childhood, and she made sure that I did too in mine. So I think that helped build a lot of my confidence versus a lot of people who just grow up with this fear of breaking all the time. And I've been there, I was there in my late teens and early 20s, and I got over it. You just kind of have to, or you won't enjoy your life. And I was at a conference last December on hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, hypermobility spectrum disorder, and related conditions. And what really stuck with me was a talk given by a patient advocate for people with osteogenesis imperfecta, which is a similar genetic condition to hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, where essentially instead of having frequent dislocations, they have frequent breakage of bones just from performing simple activities. And his motto was, it's better to have one more broken bone and more life experiences than less life experiences. And, don't live your life with the fear of, just limiting activities out of fear. And I really liked that perspective. And I think that it is really important for anyone out there listening to, I do think it's useful to have a diagnosis. It was incredibly relieving for me finally to get a diagnosis and realize, oh my gosh, I don't have, 20 different illnesses. I felt like I was just collecting illnesses, and it was really uncomfortable for me. What I realized was that everything just kind of fit neatly under this one umbrella. Oh, I just have one issue, and it's causing, yes, this constellation of issues. And I can get better by doing physical therapy. I can, modify the way that I eat. I can improve my lifestyle. I can pay attention to these things. I can't control everything. It just feels so great just to let go of wanting to control everything too. Like I did in my late teens when I wasn't ever sleeping. So I think that, we all have to find our life balance, and that there is always room for improvement, no matter how dire a diagnosis may seem.
You had mentioned that you dislocated your scapula and that it was painful. Are most of the dislocations painful, or do some dislocations not have any pain associated with them at all?
So everybody's experience is a bit different. There are some people who can painlessly dislocate or sublux parts of their body as, kind of party tricks. I do know someone who can do that with his shoulders, and it is a bit excruciating to watch. It's actually not recommended to show off party tricks, even if the dislocations don't hurt. I can still do that to my little finger, but I don't do it very often. Literally, I just, it's just a geneticist follow-up visits where you show off the weird stuff you can do, because you can actually, in the long term, cause micro trauma that can, make you more prone to arthritis and other, chronic painful conditions in later life. My experience has been, for the most part, that the dislocations that I've experienced are very painful. The scapular dislocation was definitely, I guess just because of the muscle groups and all of that involved, it was partly really painful because I was in a situation speaking for about 100 in front of about 150 people, and I couldn't really do what I would have done at home, which was, maybe lie down and try to get in a better position. I just had to keep standing in that position. And it was awful. And of course, had to keep my same facial expression and just keep talking in my normal tone. So I think that contributed to the pain, but it definitely is painful regardless, at least in my experience, when I suddenly dislocate something. I remember I was in Venice in May, and I was standing in front of a restaurant reading a menu, and a guy who was in a little bit of a hurry rushed past me and brushed against my right arm, and my shoulder dislocated, and I literally just let out this big yelp. And the guy was like, "Oh my gosh, what happened? What happened?" I was like, "It's not your fault. It just hurts. Just keep going. You didn't do anything. It's not your fault." But it really hurt. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And as we can see, there's a lot going on physically and emotionally with the hypermobile population. So what are some strategies that you apply when you're working with these type of people to be able to, touch base on all of these different areas that they're having issues with?
Yeah, I think that a lot of it really just has to do with, trying to get out of a place of fear and getting forward, as much as possible in a place of empowerment, which also means, ironically, for some people, but it isn't really a paradox when you start to think about it. Empowerment comes from a place, when you do have a chronic illness like this, of letting go of a need for control. It really has to do with just accepting that unpredictable things that aren't always pleasant can sometimes happen. And that shouldn't, it's a little bit like learning a foreign language. I spent many years teaching Italian to American students, and one of the first things that I always struggled to teach my students was really, don't just put together simple, boring sentences that are error-free. Take risks. Try to say complex things. Work on communicating, because that's really what it's all about. And it really is very similar, actually, to my outlook on resilience in situations of chronic illness. I'm not saying, do crazy stuff that will, that will put you at risk of something major. What I'm saying is, if you are afraid to get out of bed, just get out of bed the next day. Maybe, just walk to the living room and sit at the table and then go back to bed if that's all you can do. But take baby steps. Be brave. If you get minor injuries, just remember that you're getting stronger every day. I do physical therapy every single day. I do my exercises. I go to my physical therapist. I try every week. Sometimes he's not available, or our schedules don't match up, or I'm not available, but I do my exercises every day, and he tells me, "Oh my gosh, I just love working with you because you're my best patient. You're so dedicated." And I'm like, "Yeah, of course, because if I slack, I'm going to get worse." So, and I really believe that, resilience, yes, it's a word that we throw around so much, and it doesn't, we don't always really remember the deep and important meaning that it has. It's really about trying to be as, I'm using a word that may be associated with, with trauma and physical and emotional pain for people who are hypermobile, but it really is about being flexible. We want to be able to be agile, both emotionally and physically, to the greatest extent that our situation will allow. And again, that means taking baby steps, starting from where you are today. I used to run the high hurdles when I was in high school, and had to stop because of my right hip dislocating. It was the hip that I would rotate as I went over the hurdle. And anyway, that was the end of that career. But to me, that's a symbol. The hurdles is a symbol. We all have our hurdles that we have to get over in life. We can't stay stuck and wallow in self-pity. We have to try to live the best life that we can, and not ask the question of, can I do X, but how can I do X? Always really trying to look at the glass half full, because it's really not that useful to look at the glass half empty or all empty. If it's like they say, if your glass seems halfway empty, pour the water into a smaller glass and just change your perspective. Because, even I realize being part of, having an identity that is partly shaped by being chronically ill. I do realize that if that is all you base your identity around, or if you base your entire social circle around, socializing just with chronically ill people, what you end up with is a bit of a stuck identity, where you just identify with being sick. And it's not a great place to be, because it doesn't really, you are somehow invested in getting some kind of recognition or rewards, both tangible and intangible. Sometimes just the emotional reward of being part of a group where before you haven't found another group that has really fully accepted you. But the trade-off is staying as sick as possible, because, once you start getting better, you're in this kind of limbo where you're too sick to be healthy and you're too healthy to be sick. And it can be a little bit of a strange and disconcerting place to be. But I think that it's really important for all of us to be as limber as possible in our social interactions, not just be friends with other ill people. I think it's really important to be friends with other ill people. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have a circle that is composed of just, healthy, normal people, whatever that means, right? But I don't think that it's healthy for a person with a chronic illness, like hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, to just be friends with other people who are chronically ill, because you can start to feel really invested in your sickness. Even just kind of, throwing around your symptoms on social media. And, sometimes weird stuff happens. Like there was this woman who went to a specialized physical therapy program that I did as well. So it was an intensive, several weeks stay in the hospital and do daily intensive rehabilitation, physical therapy stuff. This woman went into the same program that I did, and she was very, very upset about the progress that she had made. And when she left, she threw a gigantic fit because all she wanted was an electric wheelchair. And the head physiatrist prescribed it to her, and now she's just in a wheelchair, not moving, because she was invested in that identity. And I find that really very heartbreaking. I think that we should all really make the effort to be as healthy as we possibly can. And I'm not saying, if you have to walk with a cane, that you should throw away your cane and risk, physical injury to yourself, or maybe not be able to walk. I'm just saying, really just do the best that you can to get better and better within the limits of what your situation is. And to, I'm working on this concept of healthy identity within chronic illness. What does it mean to develop an identity that is healthy while at the same time having a body that is not 100% healthy? I have been actually judged by other healthcare practitioners for admitting to being chronically ill. I did for some time not really talk about my chronic illness with colleagues because I was afraid of being judged. And once I did start, mentioning, here or there, I have this issue, I just, dislocated my scapula while I was speaking yesterday. They're like, oh my gosh, you should know enough about nutritional therapy to not have any health problems. And that's really not what it's all about. So there can be, like I said, this unhealthy investment in almost kind of showing off how ill you are, where you get rewarded socially for that. And at the same time, there can be a terrible stigma, especially in certain types of healthy circles, physically healthy. And always imagine quotation marks around the word healthy, because there's nobody who has perfect health. There can be an incredible shame that and stigma that can be attached to someone, especially someone like me who works in the holistic health world, who and where you can sometimes be judged very harshly if you're not able to heal yourself completely. And I have had people, very well-meaning, wonderful people, throw things at me like, you should just everything has an emotional cause, and you should go back and look at your childhood traumas and all of this. Yeah, I mean, I do. Everybody has emotional baggage to work on, and I have, my fair share of traumatic childhood memories for sure. But that's not 100% of my explanation, and there isn't, a single, nutritional supplement or protocol that will cure me. I literally do have this underlying constitutional issue that I will carry with me, but I have gotten a lot better over time. And, I went from having, 3-4 times a night dislocations of my shoulder to having, to actually moving this summer and being able to carry some pretty heavy objects. And I went up and down a lot of stairs in the process of moving. We have 2 flights of stairs in our new house, and we had 1 in the old one. And, I managed to do it because of my resilient outlook, and because of my just hardworking, daily efforts with physical therapy. I would not have been able to even help with my move if I had not, just really worked on a daily basis on this. If I had remained stuck in kinesiophobia, or in this, in a worldview where I was somehow invested in showing the world how ill I am by remaining constrained and constricted, and having a very restricted lifestyle and restricted physical activity, then I wouldn't have been able to do as much as I did. And I definitely wouldn't be able to travel internationally, back and forth from Italy to the US every year, and, see all my favorite people and go to conferences. Every time I buy my ticket, I don't know if something's going to happen to me last minute, but I buy my ticket, and I go. Every year I've been able to go, and there have been times where I'm not, where I've spent an afternoon crying because I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to talk the next day at a scheduled event that I've been invited to speak at. But I've always somehow managed to do everything that I've set my mind to. I'm a very stubborn person, and I do think that can be, if it's well channeled, a good asset. I'm not saying, spend a year and a half or 2 years without sleeping at night except Mondays like I did in my late teens. It was not setting a good example in my stubbornness, but still, there are ways that you can productively channel your stubbornness and have, build a healthy identity and build healthy interpersonal relationships. I have, my husband doesn't have any diagnosable chronic illnesses of any kind. He is a very understanding person. And I have, I do feel like I have been able over time to communicate to him what my limitations are, and he's as supportive as he can be. Is he 100% perfect all the time? No. But that would be a little suspicious if he were, right? One of those too good to be true scenarios. I have, I'm living the life of my dreams in a beautiful place. And that is partly because I've been able to just have this kind of fighter attitude, this warrior attitude of I'm just going to do everything I can to get better day by day, baby step by baby step. I'm going to have setbacks. Those happen. I just deal with them as they come about and just keep on moving, because I think that's, really the only way that I'm going to get where I want to in life.
Yeah, you had so many good points in what you were just saying, and especially when you're talking about, being a practitioner and people looking at you funny because you have these health issues. I can't think of a single practitioner that I know that doesn't have some kind of health issue that they're battling.
Yeah.
And I think some of the best people or practitioners out there are ones that have gone through different health issues and have learned from themselves and been able to apply it to the people that they work with. So
absolutely. Yeah.
And like you were saying, we all come from different walks of life, whether you're just a person that has hypermobility or you have these other health ailments. It is a part of you, but it doesn't have to define you. It doesn't have to make it so you stay, in that wheelchair because you think that will protect you from dislocating your hip. So
yeah,
we can all try to be the best we can be, and that's the best that we can do.
Exactly, yes. And as I always say, if you're doing your best, remember there's nothing better than the best. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, Sara, do you have any final words that you want to share? I know you just dropped a lot of truth bombs there, so didn't know if you had any more.
Yeah, just to anybody listening who may be struggling with chronic illness, whether associated with hypermobility or not, I just really want to say, I don't want you to get the wrong impression from anything I've said. I don't want you to feel like I've in any way judged you. Everybody at some point feels hopeless. Everybody at some point feels like they can't move forward. And if you're struggling, just make sure that you reach out for help. Make sure that you don't be afraid to tell people, I need help. You'll find your true friends that way. You'll build your real community that way, because those people who will listen to you, who ask you, how are you today? And you just break down crying and you say, oh my gosh, it's just been the hardest month ever. That person who listens to you and, makes you a cup of tea and just lets you talk and, holds space for you in your pain. Those are your true friends. And, again, find a good support network, even a professional support network around you to help. In my professional role, I do so much to support people with nutrition and lifestyle and just help them. I work a little bit as a traffic director to people, making sure that they get the right kind of care from practitioners, who have a different scope of practice from mine. So for example, somebody, a therapist who may be, focused on trauma recovery, or, physical therapists. I refer a lot to those, as you can imagine, that kind of thing. But, just really make sure that you're getting help, because so much of the time we all try to do too much. Everybody who is struggling with a chronic illness is a superhero. You don't have to do everything on your own to stay a superhero. It's every day is its own set of obstacles that you have to overcome. So, like I said before, if you're doing your best, there's nothing better than the best.
And people can find you at buildnurturerestore.com. You work a lot with very complicated cases, and I know Sara gets a lot of referrals from other nutritional therapists. So she is definitely known in the community to be the person that works with very complicated cases. So once again, you can learn more about her at buildnurturerestore.com. Are you on any social media channels?
I am, yes. I'm on Facebook as Sara Russell NTP. I'm on Instagram and Pinterest, also as Sara Russell NTP. I'm on Twitter, but I have to admit, not very much, as Sara Russell NTP. So, yeah, you can find me on the web as buildnurturerestore.com and on social media as Sara Russell NTP. And Russell, Sara with no H and Russell with 2 L's.
Awesome. And we'll have all that in the show notes at summitforwellness.com/59. Thank you so much, Sara, for coming on and being vulnerable with us and sharing your truth and your being open with all that you have gone through with hypermobility, and for reaching out and telling others that may be going through this just what they can do to better their situation. So thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Brian, for having me on the show and for being such a great host. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who's listening.
Well, there you have it, folks. Even though we were talking about a very niche type of population, a lot of the information that Sara brought to this episode can be applied to so many different situations. So if you can take away anything from this, it's that we all are starting at some point. And the best we can do is to try to be the best that we can be. So never stop trying and always try to improve your health to the best that it can be. Okay, next week we will have Mike Lee onto the show, who is an OPEC certified fitness coach, and he does a lot of training with professional CrossFitters. So he comes on to talk about his scientific approach to fitness and how he trains athletes differently than he would train just general population. So super fun conversation, and it's a little different than what we normally do. So it was definitely a lot of fun for me. If you enjoyed this episode, then please go to iTunes and leave us a rating and review. They really do make a difference. That would be why every single podcast out there talks about leaving reviews and ratings. So if you go to summitforwellness.com/iTunes, it would really help us out a little bit to get out in front of more people. So your support helps us to continue with the show to provide this health information to a larger audience. Keep climbing to the peak of your health, and we will see you next week.